Night Pictures, a Good Omens fanfiction. Written by Noodlefrog. Read aloud by SkyAsimaru. If you enjoy this podfic, you can check out the original story on Archive of Our Own. If you would like to hear more of my recordings or see some of my own work, you can find me through the pen and screen name of SkyAsimaru. Night Pictures. Summary. Aziraphale's new iconograph has begun taking pictures of him that come out looking a lot more explicit than what is actually happening in front of the lens. A Discworld AU. Notes. Look, I've been on a Discworld reading binge, and something happens to your brain when you read 6 of those little bastards in 3 months. The imps never fail to amuse me, so here we are. You probably don't need to be super familiar with Discworld to figure out what's going on here. Instead of cameras, they have little boxes called iconographs that have tiny demons in them that paint you. Beyond that, the rest is simple. I mean, it's fucking not rocket science. They're letting absolutely anybody do rocket science these days, so it can't be that hard. Unlike other things discussed in this story. You should still read Discworld, though. If you haven't yet, consider this a formal solicitation. Night Pictures, Part 1.
I think my iconograph is broken,
Aziraphale said. Madame Tracy looked at him over the rim of her teacup.
The one I got you last Hogswatch Day?
Aziraphale nodded in answer.
Oh dear, has it stopped working? You may want to open up the door on the side and check if it's still in there. Sometimes the little imps evaporate. Go back to, wherever, I suppose.
Gods, what a horrible thought! Aziraphale shuddered.
No,
he said firmly.
The imp is still in there. I've seen him, and he is still making pictures.
So what's the trouble with it, then? It's not out of paint, is it? They do run out of a colour sometimes, and you have to replace it. I buy extra pink for mine to have on hand.
No,
Aziraphale paused, trying to find a way to ask the question politely.
Tracy, is it a special iconograph?
Oh, I'm sure I don't know what you mean, love.
Aziraphale put his cup back in its saucer, feeling oddly self-conscious about the whole business. Still, if anyone knew how to be delicate when it came to sensitive matters, it would be Tracy. Madame Tracy Potts also knew how to be indelicate when it came to sensitive matters. It was a service that many of her clients requested specifically, and they tended to leave happy if a bit disinclined to sit down for a few hours after.
Perhaps I should just show you.
He reached into the pocket of his coat and produced a carefully folded handkerchief. The little glass squares were so fragile, and although they were certainly unusual, they were also rather precious to him. He hadn't wanted to risk any of them getting chipped while he was out and about in the city. While Tracy watched, he opened up each new fold, one at a time, revealing image after image. Well, he revealed most of them, anyway. The last one was the sort of thing that shouldn't be shown in public, not even in the home of a member of the Seamstresses Guild. Not without pay, anyway, and it was Tracy's day off. Thankfully, Aziraphale was a master of sleight of hand, and he was confident that he'd managed to flip that picture upside down and slip it back beneath the handkerchief before anyone got an eyeful.
What do you see when you look at these, Madam Tracy?
Aziraphale said, handing her the first few pictures. She examined them for a while.
I see you, Mr. Fell. They're very good, too. Flattering angles.
Aziraphale paused as his manners caught up with the rest of her statement.
Thank you. My brother has been talking quite a lot about getting family portraits done, and well, if you're going to sit there for that many hours, you hope the pose looks all right in the end, you know?
Makes sense to me, dear.
Tracy lifted one of the images up for a closer look, then whistled.
And you said you thought your iconograph was broken?
She tilted it to look at the back, which allowed Aziraphale to see which one she'd chosen for this detailed inspection. It was the one where he was standing with his hand resting on the back of an armchair, his face looking away from the iconograph's lens. He must have inadvertently stood in such a way that he got hit by a sunbeam coming through one of the windows high in the bookshop's dome, because this tiny picture showed his hair shining like it had been spun from gold. Aziraphale was fairly certain that his hair had never done that in real life. He was also certain that he'd never looked quite so pretty before, in general, for lack of better phrasing. He could have dismissed it as just a quirk of the light if it had only been the one picture. But there was something off about quite a few of the images the iconograph had produced in the last month or so, not to mention those two from the last few days.
Do you see anything else?
Aziraphale knew he sounded a bit desperate, but surely she must see it.
Anything besides, just me?
She paused, then said,
No. Is there something I should be seeing?
Are you certain that it's accurate? That it looks like me?
She clicked her tongue.
Oh, now, Mr. Fell, I won't hear a word of you doubting your own good looks. These are very handsome pictures because you are a very handsome man. If you won't listen to me, trust your iconograph. They're entirely accurate, you know. Even the watch uses them.
Silently, Aziraphale took the first batch of pictures back and gave her another one.
Well, now, Mr. Fell,
Tracy said, raising her eyebrows.
I'm happy to see you've been making use of my little present.
That's just it,
Aziraphale said wretchedly.
I didn't take these pictures.
Tracy's painted lips contracted immediately into a thin, sharp line.
Mr. Fell,
she said,
are you telling me that someone else made these? Without you asking for it, I mean.
Oh, goodness, no, my dear lady. That isn't it at all.
Aziraphale coughed.
What I mean to say is that, well, I did take these, sort of, but not exactly. I took them, but the image that came out was different than what it was when it happened.
You've lost me, dear.
She gave him the image back. Aziraphale lifted it up and tilted it so that it caught the light of the nearest candles.
This one is from the day before yesterday. I had just gotten a new waistcoat, you see, and I thought, well, it was rather well made, I thought. It went so well with my coat, and I was feeling rather, self-confident.
Oh, there's no need to be embarrassed by a thing like that,
Tracy told him, reaching for her cup again.
You liked the way you looked, and you wanted a record of it. No shame in that.
Yes, but...
Aziraphale gestured towards the tiny image of himself.
I was wearing a shirt when I took the picture.
It was a faithful representation of the back room of his shop in nearly every aspect, from the color of his sofa to the way the light streamed in through the dusty windows. The waistcoat itself had been rendered in painstaking detail, too. He'd checked it against the real item and confirmed that the pattern had been copied flawlessly, though the finished picture was small enough that the embroidery couldn't have been painted with a brush any larger than an eyelash. His chest hair had been given a similar treatment, even though Aziraphale knew that it hadn't been visible when he'd asked his picture imp to capture the moment. Tracy peered at the picture, then up at Aziraphale.
Which shirt was it?
This one.
May I?
She reached out a hand and rubbed a pinch of his sleeve between two fingers.
It feels solid.
It is a real shirt, I assure you. And before you ask, no, I haven't been meddling with anything magical.
And no new grimoires in the shop, then?
Certainly not. You know I don't keep that sort of thing on the shelves. They give the other books ideas.
Aziraphale paused, set the picture down, picked up the last one, still folded in his handkerchief.
And it isn't, only my shirt that has pulled a disappearing act. I apologize, my dear lady. This one is a bit, inappropriate.
Nothing I haven't seen before, dear.
Tracy chuckled and took the picture from him. She examined it closely.
And I expect you're going to tell me that you were wearing trousers when this one was taken too?
Yes!
Aziraphale felt his cheeks turn a bit pink, even pinker than the tiny pair of cheeks depicted in the image, in fact.
I had just gotten the ladders repaired, and I thought it would be good to
get a picture of you up near the top of one of your shelves?
Tracy guessed.
Quite. It seemed like it would be, well, when you have very tall shelves and a ladder with wheels and an iconograph, why not?
Oh, I agree. It's a very good picture. Very dramatic posing, you reaching out for that book like that.
Tracy smiled.
Your picture imp had excellent timing, even if it did forget to paint on your trousers.
Do you think that's it, then? Do you think he forgot? I didn't know they could do that.
A pause.
This iconograph is, a standard issue, isn't it? Not some special version your guild has, developed?
Aziraphale added, meaningfully.
What? Do you think the Seamstresses Guild is breeding pornographic picture imps? I imagine those would fetch quite a price, especially if they knew how to paint a person larger than life.
Tracy laughed, then tilted her head to the side. She thought for a moment, then scoffed.
It would never work. The poor little things have absolutely no imagination.
Could he be... is he sick or something?
Aziraphale asked.
Can picture imps get sick? Does he, could he need spectacles?
Oh, I'm not an expert, dear. I just bought the thing,
Tracy admitted.
Did you ask the imp about it? What did it tell you when it made the pictures?
His name is Crowley.
Oh, it is it?
Tracy said. Somehow she had managed to fit 3 extra letters into a 1-syllable word.
And what does Crowley say about it when you ask him?
Aziraphale thought back to the little imp that lived in the iconograph, no taller than a human's thumb. He pictured that sharp and sneering face he so frequently saw peering up at him. Those bat-like ears, that shock of red hair. He tried to mimic the imp's drawling voice.
I just paint what I see. And then he asked me if I wanted to paint it myself, if I'm going to be such a critic.
Aziraphale sighed.
I haven't been pressing the issue. Most of the pictures come out as expected. It has only been just these few that have been so, well, strange. And he gets so offended if you imply that there might be something wrong with what he paints.
Tracy took a long sip of her tea, then put it down again. Her lipstick mark stood out against the porcelain like a welt raised on skin that had never seen the sun. Aziraphale suspected that she may have selected the color for that precise reason.
Is that all you've been taking pictures of, then?
She asked lightly.
Just pictures of your new waistcoats and your ladder? Test runs for the family portraits?
I also,
Aziraphale said, and folded his hands very precisely over the handkerchief where it lay so very innocently on the table.
Take pictures of my books.
Mm-hmm. And which books would those be, love?
Tracy smiled at him like a crocodile.
The works of prophecy? Your poetry collection? Or have you perhaps been taking pictures of the books you need that special license in order to sell? The ones with those charming little illustrations?
It is very important for a merchant to keep an accurate and detailed inventory of his stock in its entirety, madam,
Aziraphale answered, his voice crisp. Tracy cackled.
Oh, perhaps you've fried the poor little thing's brain, she said. You've shown him too much, and now he can't stop seeing it. Maybe he's combining images, layering them over top or something.
A pause.
It might be that he's distracted on the job. Not his fault that he has such a handsome man around the house.
Aziraphale was surprised by how flustered that suggestion made him.
I don't think it's that at all, Tracy, and I would appreciate it if you wouldn't poke fun at me.
I'm not poking anything on my day off, love.
She gave him a filthy wink.
That's against guild rules.
He ignored her, his mind determined to propel itself further along this ridiculous line of thinking. It took his sputtering mouth with it.
I don't even think that they can, surely they aren't, equipped for that sort of thing.
Tracy patted the back of his hand. Like all artisans, her hand had become calloused over the years after a lifetime of working with the tools of her trade. There was a strength to that hand that would have frightened a weaker man and caused a straighter one to have cause to, straighten his trousers.
Trust me, love, she said. In my line of work, you learn that anyone can. And I do mean anyone. You just have to want to. And you can find a way.
It wasn't a very long walk back from Tracy's house to Aziraphale's shop. They both lived on the Ankh side of the city, which meant that they could both cater to a certain class of clientele. However, they both also lived within sight and smell of the river. This was due to the fact that the city's old money families wanted the convenience of proximity when they sought out ladies of negotiable affection and rare book dealers with a keen eye for certain genres of fiction, but also did not want their neighbors to be able to peer through their curtains and watch them seek out those services. Tracy had acquired her property decades ago, when it had been left to her in the will of a well-to-do gentleman who liked for his mistresses to live close enough for him to visit in the night, without having to let his coachman know where he was going. Aziraphale had purchased his shop using a good chunk of his inheritance, which his brother had called foolish. But it had at least gotten him out of the family home and into a space of his own. Once he and Tracy had gotten to know each other better, they'd found a sort of camaraderie in being on the outside of the blue-blooded society that flourished on this side of the river. It was years ago now since they'd first met. They'd both been on the job at the time, and for a while everything had been purely business between them. Within a few months, though, their professional acquaintance bloomed into the sort of casual friendship they enjoyed today. The Guild of Merchants and the Seamstresses Guild didn't often collaborate, at least not with so much paperwork involved. But the distribution of pornography was an area where the two guilds' interests overlapped. When Aziraphale had submitted an application to expand his business, Madame Tracy had been assigned to him as a liaison to assure that everything would be done above board, a phrase she had laden down with so much innuendo that Aziraphale had worried about the structural integrity of his floors. She would later tell him that she'd been pleasantly surprised that he hadn't also tried to bring himself on as a client in other capacities.
"It gets so exhausting, you know," she'd told him. "Always having to keep up a good face in front of the customer. Sometimes a girl just wants to have a nice glass of wine, put her feet up for a few hours, and not have to worry about calculating a bill at the end."
Naturally, Aziraphale agreed wholeheartedly. Tracy was one of the few people who could come into the bookshop to browse that wouldn't make him feel anxious. He knew that she knew how to be gentle with a spine, for one. And for another, she never tried to buy anything. Aziraphale and Co. was not a profitable bookshop, which was a fact that irked Aziraphale's brother to no end. It was embarrassing, Gabriel said, for the brother of a member of the Merchants Guild Council to consistently come in at the bottom of the guild's surveys of the city's businesses. Aziraphale ignored this line of complaint. He paid his guild dues on time, and he made enough money repairing damaged books that he only occasionally needed to dip into what remained of his inheritance to keep this place running. In every regard, Aziraphale's shop was his sanctuary. He lived there, yes, in the little flat upstairs. But it was more than that, too. The books on the shelves were precious to him. They represented memories and experiences, which was why it pained him so greatly every time he found himself unable to wriggle out of a sale. Tracy understood that, too. She teased him for it, of course, but in a way that made it clear that she found his peculiarities endearing instead of tiresome. That was why the iconograph had been such a thoughtful gift. It wouldn't truly replicate a lost book, but Aziraphale still found a sense of peace in carefully cataloging his collection. He had a cabinet in his back room with dozens of small drawers that he used to store away the glass picture squares, all organized according to a complex system of his own devising. Sometimes, when he'd had a bit too much to drink and was feeling a bit too maudlin, he would take out some of the pictures of books he'd had to sell and sigh. It was lucky that the imp in the iconograph was such a clever artist. He captured every detail he saw, so looking at his pictures was almost like looking at the real thing in miniature. At least that was how it had been until a month ago. Oh, the pictures Crowley made of the books were still flawless. The pattern was obvious. He had been reluctant to say this to Tracy too directly because he knew her and knew the kind of conclusions she was likely to draw. But Aziraphale had noticed that it was only the pictures of himself that were coming out inaccurate. Somehow, the imp had started painting him to look like some sort of avatar of beauty incarnate. And in the last few images he'd made, he'd started leaving some of Aziraphale's clothes off, too. Tracy's theory of bleed-over images was intriguing, if perhaps a bit fanciful. He supposed, though, that it was worth considering. Truthfully, Aziraphale had been cataloging his collection of erotica rather extensively over the past month, and had made heavy use of the iconograph during that time. Crowley had been, well, perhaps not a cheerful participant in the work, since Aziraphale hadn't known the imp to be cheerful about anything since he'd met him. But his complaints hadn't been any sharper than usual. The dear creature complained constantly, even when he seemed to be enjoying himself. At this point, Aziraphale wondered if Crowley perhaps considered grumbling to be a form of entertainment, as he always seemed to be a lot happier while he was doing it. While he was copying the pages of the more explicit text, Crowley's complaints took on a more professional angle. He seemed personally offended by the artists of these other illustrations, and while he did duplicate the images faithfully, he did so while muttering about things like anatomy and proportion and
Gods, you'd think her back would hurt from doing that, eh?
Aziraphale inexplicably found this whole grumpy performance rather endearing, and he'd spent a number of enjoyable afternoons over the past month thumbing through pages and adding certain commentary of his own. Still, he had to admit that the timing seemed relevant. Over the past month, the poor dear had been painting rather a lot of bare chests, bare buttocks, and, well, a lot of bare skin in general. Picture imps were creatures that operated at high speed, completing their tiny portraits in a matter of seconds. It was likely that Crowley relied quite a lot on instinct and muscle memory. Was it possible that Aziraphale had somehow overwritten the imp's training? Taught him new patterns that were leaking into the rest of his images? There was, Aziraphale supposed, only one way to find out. As soon as he got home, he locked the shop door behind him, turned the sign over to closed, and headed for the back room. After a moment's thought, he also poured himself a glass of wine. The iconograph was on his desk, exactly where he left it. It was an innocuous wooden box, smaller than many of the books on Aziraphale's shelves, but the lens at the front of it gleamed like a massive dark eye. He rapped on the lid of it as politely as he could. A few seconds later, a small door was pushed open on the side, and an incredibly tiny head poked out.
"More books?"
Crowley asked him. It was impressive. No matter what he said or did, the little thing was always slouching and stretching out his words like gravity and time were things that were terribly inconvenient to him.
No.
Aziraphale settled onto the sofa so that he would be more or less at face height with the imp. From this angle, he could see a sliver of the space inside the box around the side of the door. He thought he could just about make out the corner of a minuscule bed. There was an easel in there, too, he knew, as well as a rack of pigments in tiny jars. Crowley was usually quite guarded about letting anyone see inside of his home, however. So Aziraphale tried not to stare quite so overtly.
"What then?"
said Crowley. There was a fractional change in his voice that Aziraphale couldn't quite interpret.
"More self-portraits?"
Not quite.
Aziraphale fiddled with his wine glass.
Well, I actually wanted to talk to you about a few portraits you already made for me."
"Go on, then."
Aziraphale pulled the folded handkerchief out of his pocket and produced one of the pictures, which he set on the top of the desk at the imp's feet. Crowley stared down at it, squinting his little yellow eyes.
"Yeah?"
he said.
"What about it?"
Imps paint exactly what they see, correct?"
Aziraphale asked him.
"And nothing else? No embellishments or alterations?"
"Well, I mean, yeah."
Crowley crossed his arms over his chest and leaned on his doorframe.
"That's how an iconograph works. Thought we'd been over this."
"We have, but, well..."
Aziraphale took a fortifying sip.
"I wanted to ask you about how my bare bottom ended up in this image."
Crowley looked at the image for several seconds in total silence before he spoke.
"I would assume it got in there the same way the rest of you did. You climbed up that ladder and asked me to take a picture. It isn't my fault that your bottom was in the shot. If you want it zoomed in on your face or something, you've got to say."
"I promise you I was wearing trousers when this image was taken,"
Aziraphale insisted, tapping a finger against the desk next to the square of glass.
"Can't help you there,"
Crowley said, and shrugged.
"I just paint
what you see, yes, you've said,"
Aziraphale snipped, then closed his eyes and sighed.
"Oh..."
It wasn't right to take his frustration out on someone who was just trying to do his job, even if something had gone rather strange in how that job was being performed lately. The pictures didn't look bad at all. On the contrary, they were extremely flattering and tended to make Aziraphale quite a great deal more attractive than he was in day-to-day life. He didn't even mind the ones that were a bit more on the risque side. Before all this business started, Aziraphale had actually been contemplating asking Crowley if he minded taking a few pictures of a more intimate nature. And not to give to anyone, really, just to have. The only thing stopping him had been the presumed rudeness of the question. There was a difference, he thought, between asking the imp to make a copy of a printed woodcut in a book and asking him to do a boudoir portrait.
I apologize, Aziraphale said, rubbing the bridge of his nose. I don't mean to insult the quality of your work. It's just that there's something strange going on, and I can't figure out what's happened. Perhaps, yes, could we do a test image?
Right now?
Crowley asked him.
If it's all right.
Aziraphale paused.
If you're busy, I can come back later.
Yeah, fine.
Crowley retreated back inside his box. The door closed behind him with a quiet snap, and the next time he spoke, his voice was muffled.
Just say when.
Aziraphale positioned the iconograph so that its lens was pointing directly at the sofa. Then he leaned back and posed himself carefully, touched the fabric of his shirt and trousers just to make certain they were still there.
Could you take the picture now, please?
There was the noise of quiet but frantic motion from inside the box, and in less than half a minute a small square of glass dropped out a slot near the bottom. Aziraphale picked it up and brought it to eye level.
Really?
He said, exasperated.
Where has my shirt gone? And my new waistcoat?
Can't help you there,
said Crowley from inside the box.
Yes, you can! You're the one who... Oh!
Aziraphale knocked on the lid again.
Just come out here and look at this, please.
Fine, but I don't know what you want me to do about it,
Crowley grumbled. A moment later, the door opened.
Oh, your clothes are back, he said.
Aziraphale looked down at his clothed body.
No, I'm not half naked, but he is.
He turned the picture around to show Crowley, who covered his mouth with his hand.
So he is,
he said around his fingers.
Yes,
Aziraphale said, exhibiting what he thought was a commendable level of patience.
But why?
The imp looked between the image and Aziraphale's body. His eyes were such a bright yellow color that Aziraphale could see the motion of them clearly, even though they were set into a body that was only an inch tall and scaled to match.
Are you certain that those clothes you're wearing right now are real?
Crowley asked.
Quite certain.
Huh.
Crowley tapped his foot.
And you haven't gotten tangled up with magic lately, have you?
Definitely not.
Aziraphale set the image down and rose to his feet. He picked up the iconograph and carried it to the window. When he looked down, he could see Crowley swaying where he stood in the doorway, holding onto the frame with both hands.
Let's have another little test, shall we? Aziraphale asked. Could you please take a picture of the street outside?
Fine.
Crowley went back inside and went to work. Aziraphale picked up the glass plate that was ejected soon after.
Why do all of those people out there have all of their clothes on? He asked.
Decency laws?
Crowley suggested, poking his head out.
Look, I don't know what you're getting at here.
There seems to be a pattern, Aziraphale said. You keep painting me with some of my clothing missing, and it doesn't seem to be happening when you take pictures of other people. I have to assume that it's something wrong with just me, then.
Crowley blew out a breath.
Look, I don't know, okay? I don't exactly look at the pictures I paint.
That gave Aziraphale pause.
You don't?
Nah, slows everything down.
The imp shrugged.
I keep my eyes on what's in front of the lens and just move my hands to copy what's there. When I'm done, I drop it through the slot.
Aziraphale pulled the curtain closed and carried the iconograph back to his desk. He thought for a long moment, then started undoing the buttons of his waistcoat.
What are you doing?
Crowley asked. He sounded vaguely panicked.
Another test,
Aziraphale said, draping the waistcoat over the back of the sofa.
Unless I shouldn't.
No, you can.
Crowley blinked up at him.
Do whatever you think is best. For the test, you know. I should get to the bottom of this.
With a sigh, Aziraphale untied his cravat, then pulled the whole shirt over his head. It felt strange to be stripped to the waist in the back room of his shop, but he needed to match the conditions of that last picture the imp had made.
Okay,
Aziraphale said, settling back down onto the sofa. He felt very silly. Crowley scurried back inside the iconograph.
Take my picture, please.
A small square dropped onto the desk soon after. Aziraphale looked at it, then down at his lap.
Crowley,
he said.
Crowley, come out here again, please.
The imp grumbled, but appeared in the doorway nevertheless.
Yeah?
It's an accurate picture from the waist up,
Aziraphale said, showing him. Then he slid his thumb out from on top of the relevant details.
Less so from the waist down.
Huh.
Crowley stared at the picture for a long time, even going as far as to take it from Aziraphale and hold it in his tiny hands so he could study it.
You see what's different about it?
Aziraphale asked.
Oh, yeah. Your trousers are gone, all right.
Is that the only thing you noticed?
Crowley tilted his head as he looked at the glass square he was holding.
Well, you do seem to be,
erect?
Yep, that.
This had gone too far.
Look,
Aziraphale said. He reached over for his shirt and shoved it roughly back on over his head.
If this is some kind of joke...
It isn't, honest,
Crowley said quickly.
Then all I can say is that it's hardly a funny joke. At least not to me,
Aziraphale continued, ignoring the imp. He'd planned to storm out of the room at that point, but he'd gotten a hand stuck in his inside-out sleeve, and it sort of ruined the moment.
This isn't a joke,
Crowley said. He set down the glass square, shut the door to the box, and walked out to the edge of the desk.
Or if it is, I'm not the one playing it. I don't even know what's going on.
Aziraphale stared at the little imp. His face was difficult to read under the best of circumstances, unless Aziraphale had his reading glasses on, anyway, which he'd started doing a lot more in the last few months. Crowley was slouching still, but that sarcastic drawl seemed to have entirely disappeared from his voice in the last few minutes. The pointed tips of his comparatively large ears were drooping. He looked genuinely concerned, as well as confused. Aziraphale ran a hand through his hair. The trouble was, experience told him that he shouldn't believe that the imp was telling the truth. But in spite of that fact, Aziraphale found that he really wanted to. People typically revealed themselves to be self-serving and callous to the point of cruelty. True kindness was a rarity, and seldom arrived without strings attached. Being 1 inch tall didn't exempt a person from statistical probability. In fact, Crowley's size probably meant that the nastiness was more concentrated than it would be if it were to be allowed to spread out through a larger body. The simplest answer to the problem of the iconograph was that Crowley was pulling some kind of cruel prank on him. And yet, when Tracy had given him the contraption in the first place, and told him it was run by an imp, Aziraphale had pictured some indistinct spirit moving within it and making wheels turn, or something like that, anyway. He hadn't really had much cause to ponder the inner workings of an iconograph before one was introduced into his life, and then he had to learn a lot more very quickly. The last thing he imagined when Tracy had handed him the parcel was that he would be inviting a 1-inch tall snark artist into his home. But by now he was quite happy that he had. Another misconception that Aziraphale had brought into this was the vague assumption that imps were somehow supernaturally tethered to the iconographs they operated. For the first few weeks that Crowley had been here, they had communicated exclusively through the cracked door on the side of the box, and Aziraphale rather expected that would be the extent of things. It had been a pleasant surprise, then, that first time he had come downstairs in the morning, to see Crowley sauntering around the desk, inspecting the book repair tools Aziraphale had left lying out the night before. Most of what Aziraphale had was fairly standard, but he did have a collection of various inks for specialty jobs. As much as he'd had any thoughts about any of this at all, he would have guessed that, out of the lot of it, those pigments would be the things that were most likely to draw the imp's attention. Instead, he'd come in to see Crowley prodding the tips of various owls, bodkins, and bone folders with the toe of his tiny, pointed boot.
Just wanted to know if they're as sharp as they look,
he drawled by way of explanation. Then he'd crawled up on top of the iconograph to petition Aziraphale to share the shortbread biscuit he'd brought down with him for an early morning snack. Crowley had been rather withdrawn at first, but Aziraphale had quickly learned that the little imp was easily bribed by wine. They'd spent a number of nights right here in the back room as they were now, engaged in collaborative grousing until the wine took its toll and Aziraphale found himself needing to go upstairs to bed. On one such occasion, however, Aziraphale had instead spent the night on his sofa. It had been a cold night, and Crowley had fallen asleep in his waistcoat pocket. This event seemed to embarrass the imp terribly, however, and Crowley seemed determined to pretend that nothing of the sort had happened. For his part, Aziraphale didn't press it. After months of this, it wasn't very surprising that Crowley had become something of a friend. More than that, Aziraphale had grown to genuinely like Crowley and appreciate his company. It was usually just the two of them in the bookshop these days. Well, aside from the occasional customer, but Aziraphale hardly counted them as people. True, Crowley complained a lot when they worked on the shop inventory, but he was a good sport about it in his own way, nevertheless. They even found a sort of routine together in the evening hours, after Aziraphale closed the shop. Aziraphale would set himself up at the desk and work on his repairs by lamplight, and Crowley would drag out all of his brushes and palettes and clean them in a thimble. Aziraphale's favorite thing to watch him do was when he mixed up new batches of pigment in his collection of minuscule jars. He hummed as he did it. Sometimes Crowley would finish his evening tasks long before Aziraphale had finished his, and he'd go sit on top of the box to watch Aziraphale at his craft. Those were some of the only times that Crowley could reasonably be counted upon to remain quiet for any length of time. It was almost like he was transfixed by the motion of Aziraphale's hands. What a shame, then, that Crowley had stopped joining him these last few weeks. Aziraphale wasn't sure when Crowley did his prep work anymore, but it must be before Aziraphale came downstairs in the morning. Was that a clue, then? Some hint that Aziraphale had done something to anger him recently? For all that the imp maintained his outwardly grumpy demeanor, Aziraphale couldn't recall a time when he'd ever seen Crowley act with the kind of genuine meanness that was suggested by this ridiculous iconograph prank. Crowley did like playing pranks, certainly, but prior to this, the biggest thing he'd ever done was glue one of Aziraphale's dull needles to the floor below his desk. That had been 2 months ago, and the imp still cackled whenever Aziraphale went to try to pick it up. As far as Aziraphale could deduce, there appeared to be 2 probable explanations for this sudden change in the iconograph's function. Option 1, Aziraphale had somehow broken some terrible unspoken social custom of imp kind, and Crowley was so terribly offended by this that he was now seeking his nasty revenge rather than bothering to talk to Aziraphale about making amends. Option 2, Crowley was telling the truth, and he really wasn't responsible for the creation of those semi-nude pictures. Of course, Aziraphale would be happier if he believed that he had not, in fact, been targeted in such a fashion, especially by someone he had grown to think of as a friend. But what was the more likely answer? Crowley didn't have to spend so much of his free time with Aziraphale. The inside of the iconograph seemed to contain a spacious and comfortable living space, and Crowley didn't seem to have any trouble getting inside it and slamming the door behind him when he didn't want company. As far as he knew, there was nothing binding Crowley here anyway, and he could leave if he didn't like it here. More than that, Aziraphale wanted to think that the imp had also grown fond of him over the last few months, and that Crowley spent this time with him because he enjoyed it. Aziraphale took a long drink and decided he might as well assume that Crowley was telling the truth, and believe him when he said he hadn't done any of this on purpose. If it turned out that the culprit behind these strange pictures really was some external entity, maybe he and Crowley could work together to solve the problem.
Right, Aziraphale said.
He leaned forward.
Let's figure this out, then. I'll want my wine for this. Do you want some?
Oh, definitely. Let me just,
Crowley darted back inside. There was a noise of hurried rummaging and a few muffled swears, but he was back out soon after. He climbed up onto his box and cast aside his paint-spattered apron. The clothing underneath was all black, at least the parts of it that typically stayed beneath the apron.
Probably best,
he said. and lifted up an empty wine glass that was no taller than a grain of rice. They'd figured out a protocol for this over time. The safest way was for Aziraphale to pick up the glass with his long-handled tweezers, then dunk it into his own cup to fill it. It was not a method that was without potential anxiety, however. Aziraphale was always terribly worried that he might pinch down on his tweezers too hard and shatter the thing. That had never happened, but he had, in fact, gone too far in the opposite direction a few times now and lost his grip. The glasses invariably sunk to the bottom of Aziraphale's own cup, and if he couldn't fish them out again with the tweezers, Crowley would be forced to go get another one if he wanted to drink before Aziraphale had finished. Thankfully, Crowley had always gotten his glass back in the end. That was another fear of Aziraphale's, the whole accidental swallowing thing. He supposed that must be one of the many advantages to sipping one's drink like a gentleman, instead of gulping it like a boor, he supposed.
What did you have in mind that we should do?
Crowley asked, taking his wine glass from Aziraphale's tweezers. He wiped his wine-wet hands on the apron lying on the roof beside him. Aziraphale stared up at the ceiling as he weighed his options.
To start, let's, could you walk me through your process, please? Step by step. Maybe if we can figure out where the problem is, we could use that to figure out what is happening.
All right. Well, how it usually goes is like this.
Crowley sipped his wine and leaned back, resting his weight on his hand.
You point me at something and say, "Take a picture, would you?" And then I'm throwing myself onto my stool and scrambling to pick up my brush. It's even harder if you're still moving the iconograph around. But once I'm in front of the glass, I just look out the lens and do what I say. Brush, 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 paint, 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 and it's done. I pull the lever to drop it down the slot, and then you're complaining about where your shirt's gone off to.
Ignoring the snark, Aziraphale peered down at the iconograph.
What happens in the slot? He asked.
Huh?
Is there anything special that happens when an image passes through the slot?
Oh, the slot? Don't know, really.
Crowley scratched behind one fleshy ear with a clawed hand.
I think the paint probably dries when it goes through there. They come out dry at the end, don't they?
Yes, they do.
Already, Aziraphale was prodding at the slot with his tweezers. He couldn't see much of anything in there, however.
It must be that it happens in there, then, because the ones that don't go through the slot take ages to dry.
Crowley took another sip.
I think it's a new feature in the modern models or something.
You're right. I do suppose that makes a certain amount of... Hang on!
Aziraphale blinked at the imp.
Did you just say that there are pictures that don't go through the slot? Are you telling me that you sometimes take pictures and keep them?
I mean, yeah.
What do you take these pictures of?
Aziraphale was rather embarrassed to notice that his voice went rather shrill there at the end.
Things?
Crowley's one-word reply answered exactly none of Aziraphale's questions, and in fact inspired several more.
Which things would those be?
Aziraphale asked him.
What could you possibly be taking pictures of that you don't want to put through the slot?
Thumbs, mostly,
said Crowley.
What?
Thumbs. I see a lot of them in my line of work.
He tipped his wine glass to Aziraphale.
Yours, mostly. At least these days.
Thumbs.
Yeah, thumbs. You know how often it is that you'll say to me, "Oh, Crowley, take a picture of this priceless book of poorly etched pornography." And then when I finally get the chance to look, I see that all that made it onto the glass is a blurry picture of your thumb. Because it happens often.
Crowley took another drink.
Not all pictures are winners, mate.
But...
Aziraphale rubbed his temple, trying to keep up with all of this.
But you told me earlier that you don't ever look at the pictures before you send them through.
Not unless it's a thumb.
Crowley tapped his forehead.
Got a special sense for detecting thumbs. All the newer imps do.
An idea was slowly forming in Aziraphale's brain. Tracy's words about images bleeding into one another were bouncing around inside his head like a thing that bounced. The thought that had presented itself was large and shapeless and thrilling, and it left little room inside his skull for such frivolous things as metaphors.
Crowley,
he said, barely able to contain his excitement.
Crowley, do you reuse the glass plates after you get a failed picture?
What? Oh, sure, yeah.
Crowley shrugged.
I don't want to run out of those, not when you're always seconds away from announcing another cataloguing spree.
Aziraphale set his glass down a bit harder than he meant. The liquid inside sloshed, but did not spill.
That's it! That explains the phantom nudity perfectly!
The phantom nudity?
Do keep up, my dear.
Aziraphale glanced around the table, looking for the most recent image the imp had painted. He didn't immediately see it, but that was no worry.
I've been cataloguing my collection of erotic literature this month. When my thumb gets in the way of one of your pictures, what's in the background? Why, nude figures, of course. Then you paint over them later, being the thrifty artist that you are. And there you have it. It's like with manuscripts, it's called scriptio inferior, the writing beneath. I suppose it could work just as well with a painting. The image below bleeds into the image above.
Aziraphale made a hand gesture that he hoped would help communicate both his meaning and the urgency of his discovery.
And that's why it looks as though I'm nude in some of the pictures.
Although Aziraphale felt very satisfied by that explanation, Crowley gave him a long, skeptical look.
I mean, I do clean the slides before I use them again. I am a professional, you know.
Pardon?
Yeah, I don't keep the duds lying around, and I definitely don't paint right over them. The paint takes forever to dry, remember? I just scrape it off, and back into a jar if I can, and then wipe it down until it's clean.
Crowley shook his head.
No sense keeping a thumb anyway.
But that's just it!
Aziraphale raised a finger in righteous, scholarly satisfaction.
I happen to collect misprints and unique texts. There are a number of palimpsests in my collection. What do they all have in common, you ask?
I didn't, but I'm sure you're going to tell me,
Crowley said, and offered up a lazy grin.
The secondary authors all tried to clean up the first text, too. Washed the ink away, in fact, to reuse it for their own needs. Parchment is expensive, and you don't want to buy more if you think what you currently have is useful. But over time, the old words rise up again. They want to be seen and read.
Aziraphale started to stand up, his eyes locked on one shelf in particular in the other room.
Why, it's just like one of the gems in my collection. To any outward observer, you would only see a rather detailed ledger of cabbage yields. But if you look closer, there is a faint impression in the background that reveals the long-lost folio of...
Sure, yeah, but I wipe everything up with glass cleaner.
Crowley shrugged.
Nothing left.
Aziraphale deflated slightly, then rallied.
Perhaps there remains something that is invisible to the naked eye up until the moment when the next image is completed. Faint etchings in the glass, or...
Why does your cork line up like that, then?
Crowley scratched his chin in thought.
Your arse, too, for that matter.
What?
Why does it all line up perfectly? If it's just accidental layering, it wouldn't line up neatly. Some of those you showed me, it looked like your actual body.
Crowley waved a dismissive hand.
If it was this scribble inferior what's-it, you'd think there'd be random cocks floating around on the margins or something.
Be that as it may.
Besides, whatever painted these clearly understands more about human anatomy than whoever made your books. Sure, maybe they're a bit optimistic about the proportions, but at least it's screwed on the right way, unlike others I could mention.
Crowley waved at the drawers where Aziraphale stored the completed archival pictures of his books.
Should we do a side-by-side comparison?
You make a compelling counterpoint,
Aziraphale admitted begrudgingly, and slumped back on the sofa. His voice turned a bit waspish in spite of how pointless he knew it would be to let himself get upset.
Do you have any better ideas, then? One single better idea?
For a while, Crowley just gave him a flat stare. Then the imp tilted his head to the side. His yellow eyes widened.
You know, it could be...
Could be what?
Aziraphale said. He was still a bit distracted, having not yet abandoned his planned sulk. Crowley shook his head.
Nah, couldn't be. Totally different.
Blinking, Aziraphale came back to himself.
No, you have to say it now. You can't just say, no, it couldn't be, and move on. You have to tell me.
No, I don't.
Yes, you do. It's my cock.
After his outburst, Aziraphale put a hand over his mouth and felt his cheeks heat.
I apologize, but please, Crowley, please try to understand why it is important for me to know. What do you think it might be?
With a groan, Crowley dropped off the roof of his box and slouched towards the door.
It isn't the same thing at all. But if you're going to get all like that, I guess you can look at it yourself.
The imp was gone for a very long time. Long enough that Aziraphale started to wonder if perhaps he decided to shut himself away instead of continuing the conversation. When he emerged, though, he was carrying such a tall stack of painted squares that all Aziraphale was able to see of him were his ears. These, Aziraphale noted, were painted on paper instead of on glass.
Right, here they are,
Crowley said, kicking the door of the iconograph shut behind him. He walked out onto the desk and set down the stack of pictures.
Totally different, but you can look if you want.
Aziraphale adjusted his reading glasses and leaned forward to look at the image on top. He couldn't quite make out what it was supposed to be. There were blobs of color and wild brushstrokes, none of which hinted at any clear subject.
I haven't shown anybody these before,
Crowley continued. He was standing nearby, and there was something anxious in his posture.
Mostly because, well, I don't know what the fuck they are.
Crowley, did you paint these?
Aziraphale asked. A moment later, he realized what a silly question that was.
No, it was the other 1-inch tall painter who lives inside my iconograph,
Crowley drawled.
Yes, okay. I know you painted it, but did you paint this? Is this a creation of yours?
Aziraphale hurried to explain himself before Crowley could interrupt with more mocking commentary.
Many human artists paint from life, but there are others who sort of paint what they imagine.
Imps don't have imagination,
Crowley said with a shrug.
It's what makes us so good at taking pictures. We copy exactly what we see and don't leave anything out or add anything in.
What were you looking at when you made these?
Aziraphale asked, and after getting a nod of permission from Crowley, began to gently look through the stack. Most of the pictures were predominantly black, but they were shot through with streaks of brilliant color, blue and red and gold, pink and white and green.
I call these night pictures,
Crowley told him, and Aziraphale was able to hear the capitalization implied in his words.
Sometimes I stay up for a while after you've blown out all the candles and gone to bed. It's so dark down here that the iconograph lens turns full black. I can't see nothing. Until I can. If I sit there for long enough, nice and quiet, I start to see things I can't see any other time. So I paint what I see.
Aziraphale flipped gently through the stack, feeling slightly awed by the whole thing. Swirls of light and color, floating on a sea of inky black.
Oh, this is incredible.
I know. I don't know what the hell it is.
He sounded so very proud of the whole thing.
I just look and let my hands move. It's not that I'm painting things that aren't there. I'm copying down the previously unseen.
As Aziraphale progressed through the collection of the night pictures, he noticed that the style of them was beginning to change. The colors started to tighten, the forms contracted. Images started to appear, faint and out of focus, but recognizable all the same.
Are these ordered in a certain way?
Aziraphale asked softly, watching as something remarkable bloomed out of the dark.
Oldest to newest, newest to oldest?
The first ones I did were on the top, yeah,
Crowley said. The most common shapes that Aziraphale saw were hands. Many of them held vague suggestions of objects that might have been tools. Aziraphale was surprised, then, to turn over one of the pictures and see his own face looking back up at him. The brushstrokes that suggested it were sharp and often incomplete, but there was no mistaking the profile. That upturned nose, the white hair. The face, oddly enough, was the thing that made the most sense out of any of this. Aziraphale may well have walked downstairs some night and unwittingly crossed the iconograph's field of vision. Crowley might have spotted him and painted him while he was busy creating his night pictures. The hands, though. Those were book repair tools. He was sure of it, and Aziraphale never worked in the dark. How could Aziraphale's hands have been one of the unseen things given to Crowley by the darkened lens? Then, near the bottom, Aziraphale saw a wash of pink. He thought it might have been another hand at first, so he squinted at it, turned it the other way around.
Crowley,
He said,
this is a penis.
The imp looked down at the image.
Yeah, I know. Weird, isn't it? Don't know what one of them was doing floating around out there. But like I said, I just take the pictures.
Bringing the little phallus up to eye level, Aziraphale gave it a closer inspection. His first thought was that perhaps Crowley had been, painting in a state of undress. Perhaps that was it, yes, and perhaps he saw his own body reflected back at him in the lens. However, although he had never seen an imp naked, and goodness, that was a thought, he suspected that this particular painting was probably depicting a human, which raised more questions than it answered. Aziraphale never wandered around the back room of his bookshop in the nude, and strange disembodied penises didn't usually go floating around in the nighttime. So where had the bloody thing come from? He just couldn't imagine how a human's cock could have gotten in front of the iconograph's lens to begin with. Well, that was just it, wasn't it? Imps didn't have an imagination, did they? That's what made them so good with an iconograph. A human illustrator couldn't be trusted to render a scene in perfect, flawless detail. Invariably, they would either add something in or leave something out. Their own perspective would skew whatever it was that they created. The brain got in the way of the eye, so to speak. Imps, by contrast, moved so quickly that the brain never got involved. They had some kind of direct line between the eye and the hand. But Crowley, the fact that he had created these night pictures, suggested something else, something strange and exciting and new. He had painted things that couldn't have been in front of the iconograph for him to see, but he must have seen them somehow anyway. Either he'd learned how to see beyond the lens, or he'd learned not to need the lens at all. Those odd pictures of Aziraphale had all shown circumstances that had never existed. Aziraphale hadn't ever gone up his ladder without his trousers on, and he'd never sat down on the sofa in the back room while naked and quite so enthused. And he still maintained that his hair had never glittered like gold either. Still, those images had somehow ended up being committed to the page beneath Crowley's brush. He hadn't ever denied that he'd painted them, only the idea that he might have done so as a joke or out of cruelty. Or knowingly at all, for that matter. Crowley painted what he saw, even if it was something that he shouldn't have been able to see at all, like hands working in a pitch-black room.
Would you mind if I stayed up with you tonight? Aziraphale asked. Watched you make a few of these, night pictures?
That was where the secret had to be. Aziraphale knew it. It had to be. He just didn't know what shape that secret would take yet.
Sure, Crowley told him, but you won't be able to see much of anything. Neither will I. That's how the night pictures work. I can't see what I'm doing if there's any light.
That's fine,
Aziraphale said. He finished the last of his wine, and Crowley followed suit. To be concluded in Part 2.